The barbed wire sings in the wind. 3 strands stretch across Arizona grassland, 2 million acres of it, claimed in 1884 by a railroad company that never laid a mile of track through here. The Hashknife brand burns into every weathered gatepost, black iron shaped like a butcher's cleaver, and beneath each mark the wood has split from decades of sun that turned grass into dust and profit into bankruptcy. Boot prints still mark the red dirt near old line camps, some left by cowboys, others by the men they were paid to shoot. This wasn't a ranch. This was the largest corporate land grab in the American West, disguised as frontier mythology. Was the Hashknife the birthplace of the cowboy legend, or the crime scene where that story was invented to legitimize theft? If you enjoy these documentaries, please like, subscribe, and comment what ranch you would like to see covered next. A historian stands at the edge of the Hashknife Range in 2024 holding a land grant map that's older than Arizona statehood. Her name is Sarah Whitman, descended from a line camp cook who worked here in 1891 for $20 a month and died without seeing his name in any company record. She spent 3 years tracking down wage ledgers, stock reports, and court documents that most people assumed were lost or deliberately destroyed. The map in her hands shows something that shouldn't exist. A private empire larger than the state of Delaware, claimed by a company that produced nothing but paper and employed men it refused to name. What she's looking for isn't romantic. It's a mathematical crime scene, 2 million acres acquired for pennies through a legal loophole that turned federal land grants into the largest corporate land grab in American history, and the cowboys who made it profitable were never supposed to leave a trace. The Aztec Land and Cattle Company purchased the Hashknife Range in 1884 for $1 per acre, $2 million total for land the federal government had already given to the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad as incentive to build tracks across northern Arizona. The railroad never laid those tracks through this particular stretch. They sold the land instead, alternating sections in a checkerboard pattern that looked like a surveyor's fever dream, odd-numbered sections to the Aztec Company and even-numbered sections remaining public domain, creating a patchwork of private and federal land so intertwined that no one could use one without trespassing on the other. The Aztec Company didn't care about the checkerboard problem. They grazed cattle on all of it, private sections and public sections alike, turning a legal technicality into an operational reality that would define the American West for decades. By 1885, 60,000 head of cattle roamed land the company only half-owned, managed by cowboys who earned $30 a month to enforce property lines that existed on paper but dissolved the moment a steer crossed them. Sarah traces the checkerboard on her map. Every odd section, owned. Every even section, federal land, supposedly open range, practically controlled by whoever had enough cattle and enough men willing to shoot anyone who disagreed. The Aztec Company had both. They branded their cattle with a mark shaped like a hashknife, a butcher's cleaver used in commercial kitchens, not ranches, a corporate symbol masquerading as frontier heritage. The brand appeared on company letterhead, fence posts, and eventually on 60,000 cattle that required an army of laborers to manage: cowboys, cooks, fence riders, horse wranglers, and line camp workers whose names appear in payroll ledgers but almost nowhere else. Most earned between $20 and $40 per month. The company's New York investors earned returns that peaked at 8% annually before the operation collapsed under its own scale, its own violence, and the mathematical reality that 2 million acres of desert grassland cannot support 60,000 cattle indefinitely, no matter how many cowboys you hire to pretend otherwise. The Hashknife wasn't a ranch. It was a hedge fund with guns, a speculative investment in beef futures backed by land the investors never saw, managed by foremen who answered to shareholders in Manhattan, and worked by men whose labor built the mythology we now call the cowboy era. Sarah knows this because she's read the annual reports. The Aztec company's investors weren't ranchers. They were financiers, attorneys, and railroad executives who saw Arizona territory as an arbitrage opportunity, buying land for $1 per acre, stocking it with cattle purchased on credit, selling beef into a booming market, and extracting profit from grass that regenerated for free. The math worked until it didn't. By 1890, the range was overgrazed. Cattle prices had collapsed, and the company was hemorrhaging money while its cowboys kept working for wages that hadn't increased since the day the first herd arrived. Chapter 2. The Stockholders Who Bought a Photograph. The Aztec Land and Cattle Company held its annual shareholder meetings in New York City, 1,400 miles from the nearest Hashknife Line camp, in buildings where men wore suits that cost more than a cowboy's annual wage. Edward Kinsley chaired the board. He'd made his fortune in railroad stocks and saw cattle ranching as a logical extension of the same principle, buying cheap, holding, extracting value, selling before the market corrects. He visited the Hashknife Range exactly once, in 1885, spent 3 days touring the headquarters, and returned to New York convinced he'd seen everything that mattered. He hadn't seen the line camps where cowboys slept 4 to a room in structures with dirt floors and no windows. He hadn't seen the open range where cattle died in arroyos because there weren't enough riders to track them all. He hadn't seen the books that showed the company losing money on every head sold while paying dividends to shareholders who assumed profit meant the operation was sustainable. Kinsley died in 1897, wealthy, respected, never having understood why the Hashknife failed. His estate inventory listed stock certificates in 23 companies, real estate holdings in Boston and New York, and a personal art collection valued at over $50,000. The Hashknife cowboys who worked the range during Kinsley's tenure earned an average of $35 per month, $420 per year, and left estates that rarely exceeded the value of their saddle and one good horse. The wealth gap wasn't incidental. It was structural. The model only worked if labor remained cheap enough that shareholders in Manhattan could extract profit from grass in Arizona without ever confronting the human cost of maintaining that extraction. Kinsley's vision of the West was a photograph, static, composed, frozen in the moment he chose to look. The reality was something else entirely, dynamic, brutal, and completely indifferent to whether Eastern investors believed in it or not. The Aztec company's board included attorneys, bankers, and railroad executives. None of them were ranchers. They hired managers to run the operation, men like Joseph Hoag Tewksbury, who lasted less than a year before quitting over the impossibility of making the numbers work, and Conrad Schubert, who stayed longer but lost cattle faster than any manager before him. The board responded to each failure the same way: hire someone new, maintain the dividend, assume the problem was execution rather than the fundamental mathematics of grazing 60,000 cattle on land that could sustainably support maybe 30,000. By 1891, the Hashknife was burning through managers and money at roughly equal rates. 3 managers in 4 years, operating losses that exceeded $70,000 annually, and a board that kept telling shareholders the operation would turn profitable as soon as beef prices recovered and they found the right man to run it. Sarah Whitman has read every annual report the Aztec company published. The numbers tell a story the shareholders refused to hear. 2 million acres purchased for $2 million, 60,000 cattle bought on credit for approximately $3 million, annual operating costs of roughly $250,000, annual beef sales that rarely exceeded $200,000, and a workforce of approximately 150 men earning between $20 and $50 per month, who somehow kept the entire operation from collapsing into complete chaos for over a decade. The company paid dividends from capital, not profit, spending down the initial investment while telling shareholders the ranch was succeeding. By the time investors realized the truth, most of the damage was already done. The range was overgrazed. The cattle were worth half what the company paid. The water sources were drying up. And the cowboys who'd kept the operation running through drought, market crashes, and criminal mismanagement earned the same wages they'd started with, $30 to $40 a month, paid irregularly, sometimes in company scrip that local merchants accepted at a discount. The model was always extractive. Take land from the federal government, stock it beyond capacity, work it with underpaid labor. Sell the beef into a volatile market. Pay shareholders from capital. Repeat until something breaks. What broke first wasn't the cattle or the cowboys, it was the grass itself, the foundation of the entire speculation, the resource everyone assumed would regenerate forever, because grass had always grown here and surely always would. The Hashknife range could support large herds during wet years. During dry years, it became a dust bowl with hooves. The Aztec company ran large herds every year, wet or dry, because the business model required volume to justify the debt, and the debt required dividends to satisfy shareholders, and the shareholders required profits that only existed on paper. By 1892, the math had stopped working entirely, but the operation continued anyway, because stopping would mean admitting the entire enterprise was a mistake, and Eastern investors don't admit mistakes until the bankruptcy filing makes denial impossible. Chapter 3. The Men Without Names. Sarah drives past the ruins of what locals still call Perkins' store, a trading post that once served Hashknife cowboys when they came in from line camps to buy tobacco, coffee, and ammunition they couldn't afford. The store's account ledgers survived in a historical society archive, and Sarah spent 2 months photographing every page, tracking purchases made by men identified only by first names or nicknames: Tom, Red, the Mexican Kid, Charlie from Texas. The ledger shows debts accumulating faster than wages, cowboys buying on credit at prices marked up 30% above what townsfolk paid, IOUs signed with X marks because half the workforce couldn't write their own names. One entry from August 1889 records a cowboy identified only as Frank purchasing a $5 pair of boots and charging them against wages he wouldn't receive for another 6 weeks. If he lasted that long, if he didn't get fired or quit or die in some accident that wouldn't make any newspaper because men like Frank didn't rate obituaries. The Hashknife employed somewhere between 100 and 200 men at any given time. History remembers maybe a dozen of their names. The anonymity wasn't accidental. The Aztec company kept minimal personnel records, payroll ledgers that listed wages paid but rarely names, employment contracts that didn't exist because cowboys worked at will and could be dismissed without notice or cause, and company reports that mentioned the workforce as a line item without ever acknowledging that the line item consisted of human beings who slept in bunkhouses without heat and worked 70-hour weeks for wages that hadn't increased since the operation began. Sarah has found exactly 3 Hashknife employment contracts in a decade of research. All 3 date from the company's final years. All 3 specify wages between $30 and $40 per month. All three include clauses allowing the company to terminate employment immediately if the worker proves unsatisfactory in any way. Language vague enough to cover anything from incompetence to asking for a raise to complaining about conditions that would violate labor laws today, but were standard practice in 1890. The Hashknife cowboys came from everywhere and nowhere. Some were former Confederate soldiers who couldn't go home. Others were farm boys escaping debt or family obligations. A significant number were Mexican vaqueros, men who'd invented most of the techniques American cowboys claimed as their own, who worked for lower wages than white cowboys and slept in separate bunkhouses and appear in company records even less frequently than their Anglo counterparts. One personnel document from 1888 lists 6 Mexicans working a line camp near Clear Creek. No names, no wages specified, just a notation that they were satisfactory workers and should be retained through the winter. The same document lists 3 white cowboys by name with individual wage amounts and notes about their skills with horses or cattle. The inequality was structural, deliberate, and so normalized that even the workers who benefited from it probably didn't think of it as a system, just as how things were, how they'd always been, how the West worked. The scale of the operation required constant labor turnover. 2 million acres demanded approximately 150 cowboys working year-round, but the actual number fluctuated between 80 and 200 depending on season, market conditions, and how many men quit or got fired in any given month. The average tenure for a Hashknife cowboy was less than 18 months. Some stayed longer, most didn't. The work was brutal. 12 to 16-hour days during roundup season, weeks spent in line camps with minimal food and no medical care, winters that killed cattle and occasionally killed cowboys who got caught too far from shelter when storms came in. The company paid wages monthly, sometimes bi-monthly, occasionally in scrip redeemable only at company stores that charged premium prices for basic goods. A cowboy earning $35 per month might clear $20 after debts to the company store, maybe $15 if he had to replace equipment or lost days to injury or illness. After a year of work, he'd saved maybe $150, if he saved at all, if he didn't spend it on whiskey or gambling or trying to forget what it felt like to work for a corporation that treated him as disposable as the grass. The work killed men. Not dramatically, no shootouts, no stampedes, nothing that would make good copy for the dime novels being published back east. Cowboys died from pneumonia contracted in line camps without proper shelter. They died from injuries sustained breaking horses or getting kicked by cattle. They died from accidents involving barbed wire, which could slice through an artery if a man fell wrong or got thrown from his horse into a fence line. The company recorded these deaths the same way it recorded equipment losses, a line in a ledger, a notation that a replacement worker was needed, maybe a deduction from the dead man's final wages to cover the cost of burying him. Sarah has found burial records for 17 Hashknife cowboys in the cemeteries near Holbrook and Winslow. 11 are marked unknown or listed only by first name. The other 6 have full names but no other information. No birth dates, no family contacts, nothing that would indicate these men had lives or histories or people who cared whether they lived or died. The Pleasant Valley War started over sheep or cattle or grazing rights or family feuds, depending on who you ask and which court documents you trust. Sarah has read all of them. The war killed at least 35 men between 1886 and 1892, turned northern Arizona into a killing ground where cattle companies hired gunmen the same way they hired cowboys, and ended without resolution because everyone involved either died or left or realized that killing your neighbors doesn't actually settle property disputes when the property belongs to a railroad company in the first place. The Hashknife played a role in this, not as victims, not as heroes, but as one of several large cattle operations that viewed violence as a legitimate business expense, hired men who were willing to kill to protect company interests, and created conditions where small ranchers and sheep herders had two choices: leave or fight. Most fought, most lost. The land went to whoever could afford to wait out the violence, and the Aztec Land and Cattle Company could afford to wait longer than men who owned 100 sheep and a family to feed. The company hired John Payne as range superintendent in 1886. Payne was a Texas cowman with a reputation for managing large crews and maintaining order through methods that didn't always involve talking. He brought his own men with him, 20 cowboys from Texas who had worked for him before, who knew how to handle cattle and how to handle trouble, and who asked few questions about what maintaining company interests meant in practice. Under Payne's supervision, the Hashknife acquired a reputation that preceded its cowboys into every town and saloon in northern Arizona. They were good workers. They were also dangerous, not individually, but collectively, as a force that represented corporate power backed by men who carried rifles alongside their lassos and who understood that their job security depended partly on their willingness to enforce boundaries that existed only because their employer said they did. The Pleasant Valley conflict escalated in 1887 when the Tewksbury family, small ranchers who ran both cattle and sheep, clashed with the Graham family and their allies over grazing rights in the Tonto Basin. The Hashknife supported the Grahams, not officially but practically, by employing Graham allies as cowboys and looking the other way when those cowboys rode into Pleasant Valley on company time and returned with stories about fence cutting or shots fired or sheep scattered across 10 miles of backcountry. The company's involvement was deniable but real. Payroll records show several men who worked for the Hashknife during the week and participated in Pleasant Valley raids on weekends, and at least 3 men identified as Hashknife employees were killed in ambushes between 1887 and 1889. The Aztec Company never acknowledged these deaths in official reports. They appeared in local newspapers as victims of unknown assailants or range disputes, and their positions were filled within days because the Hashknife always had more applicants than jobs. The violence wasn't romantic. Men died in ambushes, shot from cover by enemies they never saw. They died in cabin raids, burned out of their homes by attackers who arrived before dawn and left before witnesses could identify them. They died in saloon fights that started over card games and ended with bodies in the street that the local sheriff, when there was one, ruled accidental or self-defense, because prosecuting cattle company employees means taking on corporations with lawyers in every territorial courthouse. The Hashknife lost men to this violence, but the company never lost sleep over it. They were replaceable. Their deaths were write-offs, and as long as the range stayed clear of sheep and small ranchers who might actually have legal claims to those federal sections the company was grazing without permission, the violence served its purpose. Sarah stands at the site where Tom Graham died in 1892. Shot off his horse while riding home from Tempe, the last major killing of the Pleasant Valley War, and the event that finally convinced everyone involved that the cost of continuing exceeded any possible benefit. The Hashknife didn't pull the trigger, but the company created the conditions where pulling the trigger seemed reasonable, where land was valuable enough to kill for, where property rights were ambiguous enough that violence became negotiation, and where the legal system served whoever had the most money to spend on attorneys and the most men willing to enforce decisions that courts were too distant or too compromised to make. The war ended. The Hashknife remained. And the range it controlled, through legal title to half the land and practical control of the rest, stayed empty of sheep, empty of small ranchers, empty of anyone who might challenge the company's claim to grass that grew on federal land the company had never purchased and couldn't legally exclude anyone from using. Chapter 5. When the grass stopped growing. A soil scientist stands in what used to be prime grazing land. You can still see the contours where the grass grew thick in 1884, before 60,000 cattle spent a decade eating it faster than weather and biology could regenerate it. Her name is Dr. Elena Martinez, and she spent 5 years studying historical erosion patterns across the Hashknife Range using core samples, old photographs, and grazing records that the Aztec company kept meticulous track of because cattle were assets, but grass was free. The data tells a story the company never acknowledged in its annual reports. The range could sustain approximately 30,000 head during average rainfall years, maybe 40,000 during wet cycles, and the Hashknife ran 60,000 head every year from 1884 to 1893, regardless of precipitation, because reducing herd size meant admitting the business model was fundamentally unsound. By 1890, the damage was visible from horseback, bare soil where grass should be, arroyos cutting deeper every season, water sources drying up because there wasn't enough vegetation to slow runoff and replenish aquifers. The company's response was to buy more cattle and graze them harder. The Arizona high desert operates on a delicate balance. Grass grows during monsoon season, July through September, and stays dormant the rest of the year, holding soil in place and retaining moisture for the next growing season. Cattle eat the grass. In sustainable systems, they eat about half and leave half, moving frequently enough that grazed areas recover before the next cycle. The Hashknife ran sustained overgrazing for nearly a decade, cattle staying in the same areas for weeks or months, eating grass down to the root crown, trampling what they didn't eat, and stripping the land of the vegetation cover it needed to survive drought. By 1888, large sections of the range showed classic signs of desertification. Invasive plants replacing native grasses, soil compaction preventing water infiltration, and erosion patterns that would take decades to reverse even if grazing stopped immediately. The grazing didn't stop. The company kept buying cattle on credit, kept stocking the range beyond capacity, and kept telling shareholders that next year's beef prices would make everything profitable. The numbers reveal the scale of ecological destruction. 2 million acres under company control, approximately 60,000 cattle at peak stocking levels, an estimated carrying capacity of 30 to 40,000 head under normal conditions, rainfall averaging 12 inches annually but dropping to 8 inches during the drought. Years of 1889 through 1892, and beef prices falling from $45 per head in 1884 to $28 per head by 1891, while operating costs remained constant at around $250,000 per year. The company was losing money on every dimension, buying cattle at prices higher than sale value, grazing them on land that couldn't sustain the numbers, paying wages to cowboys who couldn't prevent the slow-motion collapse of the entire ecosystem, and issuing optimistic reports to shareholders who wouldn't visit the range and see the damage for themselves. Elena points to a wash that didn't exist in 1885. Historical photographs show flat grassland. Current topography shows a 15-foot-deep arroyo cutting through what used to be prime grazing, the result of 1 decade of overgrazing followed by one major storm that stripped away topsoil the grass would have held in place. This pattern repeats across the Hashknife Range: arroyos where there were meadows, bare rock where there was soil, invasive shrubs where native grasses once grew. The transformation wasn't gradual, it was catastrophic, compressed into less than 10 years, and driven entirely by decisions made in New York boardrooms by men who believed grass was infinite and nature would always cooperate with profit projections. The cowboys saw it happening. They reported deteriorating range conditions to management starting in 1887. Management ignored the reports because acknowledging them meant reducing herd size, and reducing herd size meant admitting to shareholders that the operation couldn't generate the returns they'd been promised. The drought that began in 1889 accelerated the collapse. Rainfall dropped by a third. Water sources that had sustained small herds for generations went dry under the pressure of 60,000 cattle concentrated on shrinking patches of viable range. The Hashknife started losing cattle to starvation, not dramatically, just steadily, a few percent per year that compounded into major losses by 1892. The company responded by purchasing replacement cattle, adding more animals to range that couldn't support the numbers already there, creating a feedback loop where each solution made the underlying problem worse. By 1893, the Hashknife Range was damaged beyond any possibility of quick recovery, the company was insolvent, and the shareholders were finally asking questions that should have been asked a decade earlier, questions about carrying capacity, about sustainable grazing, about whether treating land as an infinite resource was a viable business strategy when the land itself was demonstrating very finite limits. Chapter 6. The Winter That Proved the Math Wrong. The winter of 1886 to 1887 killed cattle across the entire American West, from Montana to New Mexico, from Colorado to Arizona. Temperatures dropped to levels that froze water sources and buried grass under snow that lasted weeks instead of days. The Hashknife lost approximately 20% of its herd that winter, 12,000 head out of 60,000, cattle that froze to death in arroyos or starved because they couldn't reach grass under ice, or simply gave up and died, standing in fields where cowboys found them weeks later. The financial impact was immediate and catastrophic. 12,000 head at an average value of $35 per animal equals $420,000 in losses, which exceeded the company's total annual revenue and wiped out 2 years of supposed profits that had mostly existed on paper anyway. The New York shareholders received a report explaining the losses as an act of God, unavoidable, unpredictable, nobody's fault. The report failed to mention that the range was already overgrazed before the winter started, that cattle in better condition might have survived the cold, or that the company's decision to maintain maximum herd size, regardless of range capacity, had created conditions where a bad winter became an extinction event. Temperatures in northern Arizona dropped to 15 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, cold for the region but not unprecedented, and certainly survivable for cattle in good condition with adequate forage. The Hashknife cattle weren't in good condition. They had spent 2 years grazing overstocked range during drought, eating grass that was already stressed and competing with 60,000 other animals for diminishing resources. When the snow came, they had no fat reserves. When the cold persisted, they had no energy to dig through ice to reach what little grass remained. The die-off was predictable. Range scientists today can look at the historical data and tell you exactly why it happened and approximately how many animals would be lost under those conditions. But in 1887, the company chose to frame the disaster as an unprecedented act of nature, rather than the foreseeable result of decisions made in boardrooms by men who had never spent a winter on the range and didn't understand that cattle are biological organisms with physical limits that don't care about shareholder expectations. The losses continued into spring. Calves born to malnourished mothers had lower survival rates. Cows that survived the winter were too weak to produce enough milk. Yearlings that should have gained weight stayed stunted because the range still hadn't recovered, and there wasn't enough grass to support rapid growth. By summer of 1887, the Hashknife herd stood at approximately 48,000 head, down from 60,000 before the winter, still above sustainable carrying capacity, and producing beef at a loss because the surviving cattle were smaller and lighter than market standards demanded. The company's response was predictable. They bought more cattle to replace the losses, bringing herd numbers back toward 60,000 by fall of 1887, restocking overgrazed range with animals purchased on credit at prices that guaranteed losses even if every animal survived to sale weight. The financial structure was collapsing under its own weight. The Aztec company had borrowed extensively to purchase the original herd, approximately $3 million in cattle debt secured against land and future beef sales. The winter losses meant they had paid interest on loans for 12,000 animals that died before generating any revenue. The replacement purchases added more debt. Annual operating costs remained constant at around $250,000. Beef prices kept falling from $45 per head in 1884 to $26 per head by 1888, a 42% decline in 4 years, while costs stayed flat. The company was bleeding money from multiple wounds: cattle dying faster than they could be replaced, beef selling for less than it cost to produce, debt service eating profits that didn't exist, and a range degrading so rapidly that every year made recovery more expensive and less likely. The shareholders started asking hard questions. Why were cattle dying at rates higher than other operations in the same region? Why hadn't the company reduced herd size after the winter losses? Why were they buying replacement cattle at premium prices when beef prices were falling? The board's answers were vague, optimistic, and increasingly detached from the reality on the ground. They blamed weather, market conditions, temporary setbacks, anything except the fundamental truth that the business model required infinite grass and cooperative climate and beef prices that stayed high regardless of supply, and none of those conditions existed or had ever existed outside the imaginations of investors who had mistaken a land grant for a guaranteed return. By 1888, the Aztec Land and Cattle Company was functionally insolvent, assets worth less than debts, operating losses exceeding revenue, and a range so damaged that sustainable recovery would take decades, even if grazing stopped immediately, which it wouldn't because stopping meant admitting failure, and Eastern businessmen don't admit failure until bankruptcy makes denial impossible. Chapter 7. The Sale That Changed Nothing. A bankruptcy attorney sits in the Arizona Historical Society archives reviewing documents from the Aztec Company's 1891 restructuring, the legal maneuver that allowed the operation to continue despite being mathematically insolvent, that transferred ownership without admitting failure, and that guaranteed the same mistakes would be repeated under new management because the fundamental problems were never addressed. His name is Michael Chen, and he's researching corporate land acquisitions in the American West for a book about how property law shaped frontier capitalism. The Aztec restructuring fascinates him because it's a perfect case study in how companies avoid accountability. When the operation failed, shareholders didn't lose their investment. They reorganized it, wrote down the losses, issued new stock, and kept grazing cattle on damaged range while telling new investors that previous management had been the problem. The land didn't change. The cattle didn't change. The carrying capacity didn't change. But on paper, this was a fresh start. A new company with new leadership making the same decisions that had bankrupted the previous operation. The Aztec Land and Cattle Company sold its assets in 1891 for approximately $650,000, less than a third of what shareholders had invested over 7 years. A catastrophic loss by any measure, and nowhere near enough to cover the company's outstanding debts. The buyer was a consortium of investors who called themselves the Aztec Land and Cattle Company. Same name, different shareholders, same ranch. They purchased 2 million acres of land for roughly 32 cents per acre, land the original company had paid $1 per acre to acquire, land that was now so degraded that honest appraisers valued it below the original purchase price because the grass was gone and recovery costs exceeded potential revenue. The new owners brought in new managers, issued optimistic statements about improved operations and sustainable practices, and immediately began running cattle at stocking rates that exceeded carrying capacity because reducing herd size meant admitting the business model didn't work. Michael traces the ownership through court documents. The original Aztec Company shareholders, men like Edward Kinsley, who'd invested in 1884 and watched their equity evaporate, took losses averaging 65% on their initial investment. Some of them reinvested in the new company at reduced rates, gambling that new management could extract profits from the same land that had bankrupted them the first time. Others sold their shares at whatever price they could get, and moved on to other speculative ventures in railroads, mining, or urban real estate where failure could be blamed on markets rather than math. None of them publicly acknowledged that the Hashknife failed because 2 million acres of desert grassland cannot sustainably support 60,000 cattle regardless of management quality, market conditions, or shareholder expectations. A truth that was obvious to every cowboy who worked the range but invisible to every investor who'd never seen it. The new company made cosmetic changes. They reduced the herd to approximately 45,000 head, still above sustainable capacity, but low enough to claim they were practicing conservation. They invested in additional water infrastructure, wells and windmills that cost thousands of dollars and did nothing to address the fundamental problem that the grass was gone and wouldn't regenerate, while cattle continued grazing it year-round. They hired range managers with better credentials and higher salaries who produced reports recommending the same solutions the old managers had recommended: reduce stocking rates, rotate grazing, allow recovery time for degraded range. The board reviewed these recommendations and ignored them because implementing them meant reducing revenue, and reducing revenue meant admitting to new shareholders that the operation couldn't generate the returns they'd been promised. By 1893, the new Aztec Land and Cattle Company was losing money at approximately the same rate as the old one, operating costs around $200,000 annually, beef sales generating maybe $150,000, and debt service consuming whatever remained. The restructuring allowed the operation to continue for another decade. Not because it became profitable, it didn't. Not because range conditions improved, they worsened, but because the legal fiction of a new company with new shareholders reset expectations and pushed accountability forward to the next crisis, the next bankruptcy, the next round of investors who would discover that owning 2 million acres of damaged land doesn't make you wealthy if the land can't produce revenue. The cowboys who worked for the new company earned the same wages as cowboys who'd worked for the old one, $30 to $40 per month, paid irregularly, in cash or scrip, depending on the company's liquidity. The cattle grazed the same overstocked range. The grass continued its slow disappearance, and the investors in New York continued receiving reports that explained losses as temporary setbacks rather than the predictable result of treating biological systems like financial instruments that respond to shareholder pressure instead of ecological limits. Chapter 8: The Babbitt Brothers and the Real Business. Sarah stands outside what used to be the Babbitt Brothers Trading Company in Flagstaff, a brick building that's been converted into offices but still carries the name in faded paint on the north wall. A reminder that the people who made real money off the Hashknife weren't the ranchers or the cowboys, but the merchants who sold them supplies at markup rates that guaranteed profit, regardless of whether cattle lived or died. The Babbitt family arrived in Arizona in 1886 with merchandise and ambition, opened stores across northern Arizona, and discovered something the Aztec company never understood. You don't get rich raising cattle in the desert. You get rich selling things to people who are trying to raise cattle in the desert. By 1890, the Babbitts controlled most of the retail trade in the region, operated on credit terms that kept cowboys and small ranchers perpetually indebted, and made more profit in a single year than the Hashknife generated in its entire existence. The trading post model was simple. Cowboys needed supplies, food, clothing, tobacco, ammunition, horse tack, tools. They earned $30 to $40 per month in wages that were paid irregularly and often in company scrip. The trading posts extended credit at interest rates between 10 and 30% annually, selling goods at prices marked up 40 to 60% above wholesale and accepting payment in cash, scrip, or future wages, with terms that ensured most cowboys owed more than they earned. A cowboy who bought a $50 saddle on credit would pay $75 over 18 months if he made regular payments, more if he missed any, and the debt followed him from job to job because trading posts shared credit information and wouldn't serve men who'd defaulted elsewhere. The system was legal, common, and completely predatory, designed to extract maximum value from workers who had no alternatives because the nearest competing store was 50 miles away and their employer often had exclusive arrangements with specific merchants. The Babbitt brothers understood what the Aztec company didn't. In frontier economies, whoever controls distribution controls profit. They owned stores in Flagstaff, Winslow, Holbrook, and Williams, every town where Hashknife cowboys came to spend wages or seek credit. They sold directly to the ranch as well, providing bulk supplies under contracts that required payment in 90 days, but charged premium prices that built in the cost of likely defaults. When the Aztec company restructured in 1891, the Babbitts were listed among the creditors, owed approximately $40,000 for merchandise delivered but not paid for, a debt that survived the bankruptcy and was partially recovered from the new company's assets, while individual cowboys who had worked for wages they never received got nothing. The scale of the merchant economy dwarfed cattle profits. The Hashknife employed approximately 150 men who collectively earned roughly $60,000 annually in wages, money that flowed directly into stores like the Babbitt Brothers Trading Company, where it bought goods marked up 40 to 60% above wholesale cost. Add the ranch's direct purchases, feed, equipment, supplies, and the Babbitts and merchants like them were extracting approximately $100,000 per year from an operation that rarely generated $50,000 in actual profit from beef sales. The Aztec company was essentially a mechanism for transferring Eastern investment capital into the pockets of Western merchants through the labor of underpaid cowboys, and everyone involved understood this, except apparently the shareholders who kept investing in cattle operations while the real fortunes were being made by people who never owned a cow. The Babbitt family thrived during the same period that bankrupted the Hashknife. They expanded their retail empire throughout northern Arizona, invested in sheep ranching, which was more profitable than cattle and less destructive to the range, and eventually became one of the region's most prominent business families, with holdings in real estate, lumber, and automotive dealerships that survived well into the 20th century. The Hashknife cowboys who bought from Babbitt stores on credit rarely accumulated any wealth. Most died broke. The ones who survived long enough to retire did so on savings that averaged less than $500 after decades of work, barely enough to buy a small homestead, nowhere near enough to compete with merchants who had built retail empires on the markup between wholesale cost and credit prices. This was the real economic structure of the American West, not cowboys building wealth through honest labor, but merchants building fortunes by selling to cowboys at prices those cowboys could never afford to pay in full. Chapter 9. The Final Accounting. A ledger from 1901 sits in the Apache County Courthouse archives, the last complete financial record of the Aztec Land and Cattle Company before it stopped filing reports, stopped paying taxes, and quietly dissolved into a network of smaller operations that bought pieces of the range at auction prices. Sarah photographs every page. The numbers tell the story management refused to acknowledge for 17 years. Total investment, approximately $5 million. Total revenue from beef sales, approximately $2.8 million. Total operating losses, approximately $2.2 million before accounting for depreciation, interest, or the ecological damage that would cost millions more to repair if anyone bothered trying. The Hashknife wasn't a ranch that failed. It was a systematic extraction of eastern capital through western land, converted into merchant profits and environmental destruction while cowboys earned wages that barely covered their debts and shareholders watched their investments evaporate into desert air. The company's final herd count in 1900 was 32,000 head, roughly half the peak stocking levels from 1886, grazing on range that could barely support 20,000 without continued degradation. Beef prices had recovered slightly from their 1890 lows, but remained below levels needed for profitability given the company's debt load and operating structure. The annual reports stopped being optimistic around 1898 and started being honest around 1900, acknowledging that the operation had never generated sustainable profits, that range conditions were deteriorating rather than improving, and that shareholders should expect no return on investment because there was no investment left to return. It had been converted into dead cattle, eroded soil, and unpaid wages that would never be recovered. The Aztec Company began selling land in parcels starting in 1902. Not to recover investments, those were gone, but to pay creditors who had extended credit based on land values that assumed grass would always grow and cattle would always sell. The Babbitt brothers bought sections near Flagstaff for grazing sheep, which were more profitable than cattle and caused less range damage because they moved faster and ate different forage. Small ranchers bought parcels when they could afford them, usually land the company considered marginal because water was scarce or access was difficult. The federal government reclaimed sections where the original railroad land grant had conditions the company never fulfilled, requirements about improvements, settlement, or development that existed on paper but were ignored in practice because enforcement was sporadic and penalties were minimal compared to profits from unrestricted grazing. By 1905, the Aztec Land and Cattle Company existed only as a legal entity managing the sale of remaining assets, land nobody wanted at prices nobody would pay, cattle worth less than the cost of gathering them, and liabilities that exceeded assets by margins that made liquidation the only rational option. The final shareholders received approximately 8 cents on the dollar for their original investments, a 92% loss over 21 years, which translates to an average annual return of negative 22%, making the Hashknife one of the worst-performing cattle operations in American history, measured by investor returns. The cowboys who worked the ranch during those 21 years received no compensation beyond their monthly wages, no profit sharing, no recognition that their labor had created whatever value the operation generated before weather, markets, and mismanagement destroyed it. Sarah calculates the total wages paid to cowboys over the Hashknife's operational life. Assuming an average workforce of 130 men earning an average of $35 per month over 21 years yields approximately $1,150,000 in total cowboy wages, money that flowed through the ranch into stores, saloons, and trading posts, creating economic activity for merchants while generating almost no wealth for the workers who earned it. Compare this to the Babbitt brothers' retail operations, which generated estimated revenues exceeding $3 million during the same period, with profit margins around 20 to 30%, meaning the Babbitts made more money selling to Hashknife cowboys than the Hashknife made selling beef. The real economy of the frontier West wasn't cattle. It was the infrastructure that extracted value from people trying to make cattle profitable. The Hashknife collapse revealed something nobody wanted to acknowledge. The cowboy era wasn't built on opportunity or frontier freedom. It was built on a wage system that kept workers poor while extracting value for investors who lost money and merchants who got rich. Nobody won except the people who never touched a cow. Narration text. This is a placeholder. 30% are owned by families who've held them for 3 or more generations, descendants of homesteaders and small ranchers who bought parcels cheap after the Aztec collapse and held on through drought, depression, and changing markets. 20% are owned by newer buyers, retirees, investors, conservation groups. The remaining 10% are tribal lands, either returned through legal settlements or purchased by tribes, reclaiming territory their ancestors occupied before the railroad. Land grants transferred it to corporations that had no legitimate claim beyond paperwork signed in Washington by people who had never seen northern Arizona and didn't care what happened there as long as railroads got built and investors made money. Hashknife's ecological legacy persists. Invasive species introduced during the cattle era, cheatgrass, Russian thistle, Lehman lovegrass, still dominate large sections of former range, outcompeting native grasses that evolved for different grazing pressures and fire cycles. Water sources damaged by overgrazing in the 1880s and the 1890s remain compromised. Springs that used to flow year-round now run only during wet seasons, aquifers depleted by a century of use that exceeded recharge rates. Climate change accelerates damage. The Hashknife started, droughts last longer, storms hit harder, and vegetation stressed by heat and inconsistent rainfall can't recover the way it might have before industrial-scale grazing stripped the landscape of resilience. The land remembers what happened here, written in arroyos and invasive plants and water tables that dropped and never fully recovered. Chapter 11. The Cowboys Who Vanished. A cemetery on the outskirts of Holbrook contains 19 graves marked only with years, no names, no epitaphs, just metal crosses stamped with dates between 1885 and 1902. Sarah has spent months trying to identify who's buried here, cross-referencing death certificates, newspaper obituaries, and church records that might connect dates to names. She's identified 6. The other 13 remain unknown. Men who died working for the Hashknife or operations like it. Men whose families either didn't exist or didn't have money for proper markers. Men whose labor built the mythology of the American cowboy, but whose deaths went unrecorded except as dates stamped on crosses that nobody visits anymore. This is the other side of frontier capitalism. Not the ranchers who lost fortunes or the investors who filed bankruptcy, but the workers who died anonymous and stayed that way because recording their names wasn't worth the cost of engraving. The average Hashknife cowboy worked 18 months before quitting, getting fired, or dying. The turnover was structural. Wages stayed flat while costs increased. Working conditions were brutal enough that only desperate men accepted them, and the company had no incentive to retain workers when replacements arrived daily from Texas, New Mexico, or anywhere else where drought, debt, or family trouble pushed men toward Arizona territory and wages that sounded better than they were. Some cowboys moved on to other ranches, chasing rumors of better pay or easier work that rarely materialized. Others homesteaded, claimed federal land under the Homestead Act, built cabins on 160 acres, and discovered that what barely sustained a line camp couldn't sustain a family. Most just disappeared from the historical record. No marriage certificates, no property transfers, no death notices, nothing to indicate they existed except payroll entries that list amounts, but rarely names. The numbers reveal the scale of failure. Sarah has documented 37 cases of former Hashknife cowboys who achieved measurable success, men who accumulated enough capital to buy land or start businesses. 37 out of approximately 2,000 men who worked the operation over 21 years. Average cowboy tenure, 18 months. Average annual wages, $420 at $35 per month. Average savings after company store debts, perhaps $150 per year. A successful cowboy who worked 5 years and saved aggressively might accumulate $750, enough to file a homestead claim on 160 acres, but not enough to stock it with cattle, build adequate structures, or survive the first bad year. The math guaranteed failure for 98% of workers, while the 2% who succeeded became the foundation of mythology that erased the 98% who didn't. The mythology celebrates different men. Cowboy memoirs published in the 1920s and 30s focus on adventure, independence, and frontier freedom, narratives written by the 2% who survived long enough to retire and had enough education to write about it. These accounts rarely mention the 98% who didn't make it, the Mexican vaqueros who worked for lower wages and got written out of history entirely, or the structural economic forces that made cowboy work a dead end for everyone except the people selling supplies or buying beef. The memoirs present cowboy life as a choice, men seeking adventure, escaping civilization, pursuing freedom. The payroll ledgers tell a different story. Men working because they needed wages, quitting because conditions were intolerable, and dying because frontier health care was non-existent, and companies considered dead workers cheaper than injured ones who might demand compensation. The legal framework offered workers almost no protection. Arizona Territory had no workers' compensation laws until 1913, 30 years after the Hashknife started operations. Workplace injuries were considered the workers' problem unless the company felt generous, which they rarely did, because generosity set precedents that might apply to future cases. If a cowboy got thrown from a horse and broke his leg, he could recover at company expense. If his boss liked him and the injury happened during work, the company considered important. Otherwise, he recovered on his own time and his own money, or he didn't recover at all. Death was simpler. The company owed nothing, usually paid nothing, and hired a replacement before the body got buried. Sarah has found multiple cases where cowboys died in spring, got buried in unmarked graves, and their final wages went uncollected because nobody knew who to pay or where to send the money. The Hashknife's labor system wasn't unique. Every large cattle operation in the West ran on similar principles: underpay workers, replace them when they quit, accept high turnover as normal, and build the business model around the assumption that labor is infinite and worthless. The system worked economically for decades. Ranches got cheap labor, cowboys got wages that beat starvation, and nobody acknowledged that the arrangement was extractive and unsustainable, because extraction is only a problem when you're the one being extracted from, and cowboys had no collective power to demand better. The industrial labor movement transformed factory work in the early 20th century. It never reached cowboys, too scattered, too transient, too embedded in a mythology that framed wage work as temporary adventure rather than permanent exploitation. Chapter 12: What the Tourists Don't See. Sarah stands at a roadside attraction 40 miles east of Flagstaff, a restored line camp that has been converted into a photo opportunity for travelers driving Route 66, complete with mannequins dressed as cowboys and interpretive signs that explain ranching without mentioning bankruptcy, exploitation, or ecological collapse. The signs describe cowboy life as adventurous and independent, the Hashknife as a symbol of frontier ambition, and cattle ranching as the foundation of Arizona's economy, all technically true and completely dishonest, because truth without context is just marketing. Tourists pose for pictures next to fake cowboys and buy souvenirs stamped with the Hashknife brand, consuming mythology that erases the men who actually lived here, the wage system that kept them poor, and the environmental destruction that required a century of recovery and still isn't finished. History becomes entertainment when the uncomfortable parts get edited out for audiences who want inspiration instead of accuracy. The heritage tourism industry in northern Arizona generates approximately $40 million annually from cowboy-themed attractions, dude ranches, and historical sites that present sanitized versions of frontier history, enough money that preserving the mythology matters more than correcting it. Tour operators emphasize adventure, independence, and rugged individualism. They don't mention that most cowboys were wage laborers earning $30 to $40 per month, that independence meant no health care and no safety net, and that rugged individualism translated to dying alone in line camps without anyone recording your name. The economic incentive runs toward romance, not accuracy, because tourists pay for stories that make them feel connected to a heroic past, not stories that reveal their country was built on extractive wage systems that enriched merchants while workers died broke. Sarah has interviewed descendants of Hashknife cowboys. Most know almost nothing about their ancestors' lives beyond vague family stories about working on a big ranch in Arizona Territory, no specific dates, No wage information, no acknowledgement that their great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather spent decades working for a corporation that extracted maximum labor for minimum compensation and left him with nothing to pass down except stories. The descendants aren't wealthy. Most are working class or middle class, living in the same economic circumstances their cowboy ancestors lived in, proof that frontier labor didn't build intergenerational wealth for workers any more than it built sustainable profits for investors. The wealth that did get built, the Babbitt family fortune, the land values that eventually recovered, the real estate portfolios assembled from Hashknife bankruptcy sales, went to people who understood that Western capitalism rewarded ownership and extraction, not labor and production. Modern cattle ranching in the region operates on completely different principles. Current operations run approximately 1 cow per 40 acres, sustainable stocking rates based on ecological science that didn't exist in 1885 and wouldn't have mattered if it did, because the Hashknife's business model required overgrazing to generate enough beef volume to service debt. Contemporary ranchers use rotational grazing, supplement winter feed, monitor range conditions, and accept that profit margins are thin because beef prices fluctuate while costs stay high, and nobody can graze 60,000 cattle on 2 million acres without destroying the land. The modern ranching economy is stable, sustainable, and barely profitable, everything the Hashknife wasn't. It survives through diversification, hunting leases, tourism, conservation payments, land appreciation, revenue streams that didn't exist in 1885 when grass was the only product and cattle were the only business model anyone considered viable. The Hashknife mythology persists because it serves purposes beyond historical accuracy. It provides identity for communities that want to connect with frontier heritage without confronting frontier reality. It offers moral lessons about perseverance and hard work that ignore the structural forces that determined who succeeded and who failed, regardless of individual effort. It creates tourism revenue that depends on maintaining simplified narratives tourists can consume in the time it takes to drive between Flagstaff and Holbrook. And it allows modern Americans to believe their country was built by independent pioneers pursuing opportunity, not by wage workers enriching corporations that went bankrupt while merchants got rich selling supplies on credit. The mythology isn't wrong exactly. It's incomplete, carefully edited to preserve the parts that inspire and delete the parts that complicate. Sarah's research complicates that mythology. Her book, when it's finished, will document the wage ledgers, bankruptcy filings, environmental assessments, and cemetery records that reveal what actually happened here. Not adventure and opportunity, but extraction and exploitation. Not frontier freedom, but wage labor in a system designed to keep workers dependent while funneling wealth to people who controlled distribution or owned land. Whether anyone wants to read that story is a different question. Publishers want marketable narratives. Readers want inspiration. And Sarah has a file full of evidence that the cowboy era was neither as romantic as tourism presents it, nor as simple as critics dismiss it, just complicated, extractive, and structured in ways that benefited everyone except the people doing the actual work. Chapter 13. The Empire Built on Grass That Belonged to No One. Sarah closes the last archive box. 3 years of research condensed into photographs, spreadsheets, and handwritten notes that will become a book nobody asked for about a ranch most people have forgotten, a corporate failure disguised as frontier mythology, an ecological disaster marketed as heritage tourism, and a wage system that kept workers poor while investors lost fortunes and merchants built empires. The Hashknife story isn't unique. It's the blueprint for how the American West actually worked, not through individual pioneers claiming opportunity, but through corporations extracting value from land they didn't understand, using labor they refused to compensate fairly, creating wealth for middlemen while the people who did the work and the investors who funded it both ended up broke. The only winners were the ones who never touched a cow or risked $1 on beef futures, the merchants who sold supplies on credit, and the lawyers who processed bankruptcy filings. The final numbers tell the complete story. 2 million acres claimed through railroad land grants that were supposed to incentivize development, but instead enabled speculation. $5 million invested by Eastern shareholders who received 8 cents on the dollar when the operation collapsed. 60,000 cattle at peak stocking on range that could sustainably support 30,000. Approximately 2,000 cowboys who worked for the operation over 21 years, earning an average of $35 per month, with a success rate below 2%, measured by men who died with wealth or property to pass down. 100 million pounds of beef sold into markets that paid less than production costs, once debt service and operating expenses were factored in. 42% decline in beef prices between 1884 and 1891, while costs stayed constant. 12,000 cattle lost in the winter from 1886 to 1887 due to overgrazing that left herds malnourished before temperatures dropped. 1 century of ecological recovery that still hasn't fully restored pre-1884 range conditions. The Hashknife proved something nobody wanted to acknowledge. The cowboy era wasn't economically viable for anyone except merchants and land speculators. Cowboys stayed poor, investors lost money, the land got destroyed, and the mythology that grew from the wreckage celebrated everything except the structural forces that determined who won and who lost, regardless of individual effort, character, or the frontier virtues tourism operators still market to people driving Route 66 looking for authentic Western experiences. Authenticity would require acknowledging that most cowboys died broke, most cattle operations went bankrupt, and the sustainable profit came from selling things to cowboys and buying assets from bankrupt ranchers, not from raising beef in desert grassland using wage labor and corporate capital. Sarah's book will document this. It won't be popular. Publishers want frontier stories with heroes and villains, triumph and tragedy, moral lessons about American character. Sarah has data showing that frontier capitalism worked exactly like modern capitalism, extracting value from workers and natural resources, concentrating wealth among people who controlled distribution, and leaving everyone else to absorb the costs, while mythology erased the mechanisms that produced inequality. The Hashknife wasn't an aberration. It was normal, representative of thousands of operations across the West that operated on the same principles and produced the same results. Some lasted longer. None made money for workers. Few made money for investors. Almost all enriched the merchants and lawyers who serviced the industry without risking capital on cattle that might starve or markets that might crash. The land Sarah stands on today is worth approximately $3,000 per acre, prime grazing with highway access, water rights, and development potential that makes cattle ranching the least profitable use of the property. The same land sold for 32 cents per acre in 1891 when the Aztec company collapsed, and for $1 per acre in 1884 when Eastern investors believed grass was infinite and cowboys were disposable. The appreciation isn't profit, it's recovery, value returning after a century of healing from damage that took less than a decade to inflict. The grass is coming back, the arroyos remain, and the fence posts still carry the Hashknife brand black iron shaped like a butcher's cleaver, a corporate logo that outlasts the corporation, marking land that belonged to no one and everyone, and ultimately to whoever had enough capital or patience to claim it after the speculators went bankrupt and the cowboys died without leaving names. This is the history tourism doesn't sell. This is the West that mythology erases. And this is the truth that makes Sarah's research necessary, even if nobody wants to read it, because understanding how the frontier actually worked matters more than preserving stories that make us feel better about the country those stories helped build. Chapter 14. The Answer Nobody Wanted. Sarah drives away from the archives for the last time. 3 years of research fits in 6 boxes in her trunk. Wage ledgers photographed, bankruptcy filings copied, cemetery records documented, and one question that started everything finally answered. The Hashknife wasn't the birthplace of the cowboy legend. It was the place where that legend was manufactured to obscure a simpler truth. Eastern investors speculated on land they didn't understand, hired workers they refused to compensate fairly, destroyed an ecosystem for short-term profit, went bankrupt, and left behind mythology that erased the mechanisms of their failure. The cowboy became a symbol of American independence precisely because acknowledging what cowboys actually were, wage laborers in an extractive system, would undermine every story we tell about how the West was won and who won it. The Hashknife proved that frontier capitalism worked exactly like industrial capitalism. Wealth concentrated among people who controlled distribution, workers stayed poor regardless of effort, and nature absorbed costs that never appeared on any company balance sheet. The barbed wire Sarah noticed in the opening still sings in the wind. The Hashknife brand still marks fence posts across northern Arizona, some original, most reproductions installed by people who want visual connections to heritage without understanding what that heritage cost. The grass is growing back, slowly, on land that federal management protects from the overgrazing that destroyed it originally. The cowboys who made the Hashknife possible are mostly forgotten, their names lost, their wages stolen by inflation and company insolvency, their labor erased from narratives that celebrate ranchers and investors while ignoring workers who did everything except profit. And the investors who funded the disaster lost 92% of their capital, proving that you can own 2 million acres and still go bankrupt if the business model requires infinite grass and cooperative climate. Sarah's research won't change the mythology. Heritage tourism is too profitable. The cowboy symbol is too embedded in American identity. And acknowledging that the frontier was built on wage exploitation and ecological destruction complicates stories people prefer to keep simple. But her book will exist, a record of what actually happened here, documented in numbers that don't lie even when the people interpreting them do. 2 million acres, $5 million invested, 2,000 workers, $35 per month average wages, 8 cents on the dollar for shareholders, 1 century of ecological recovery. These numbers tell the truth better than any mythology, and they reveal a pattern that extends far beyond one failed cattle operation in Arizona territory. American capitalism has always worked this way, extracting value from workers and nature, concentrating wealth among intermediaries, and producing mythology that celebrates everything except the structural forces that determine who wins and who loses. The Hashknife failed. The cowboys died broke. The investors lost fortunes. The merchants got rich. The land is recovering. And the mythology persists because frontier stories that acknowledge complexity don't fit on roadside historical markers or in tourist brochures selling authentic Western experiences. Sarah's ancestor, the line camp cook who earned $20 per month and died without leaving anything except a name in a payroll ledger, is buried in one of those unmarked graves in Holbrook. Sarah found the cemetery record, but no gravestone, no obituary, just a death certificate listing cause as pneumonia and occupation as ranch worker and next of kin as unknown. He worked for the Hashknife for 8 months in 1891. He made $160 total. He died at age 32. And the mythology that grew from operations like the one that killed him celebrates cowboys as symbols of freedom while erasing the wage system that kept them poor and the corporate structures that guaranteed they'd stay that way. This is what the barbed wire marks. Not property lines or ranch boundaries, but the edge of a story we tell ourselves about America. A story where hard work leads to success, where frontier opportunity was real, and where cowboys rode free instead of working for wages that barely covered their debts to company stores. The truth is less inspiring and more useful. The West was won by corporations using underpaid labor to extract resources until ecology collapsed and markets crashed, leaving workers with nothing, and investors with losses, and merchants with fortunes, and descendants with mythology that makes the extraction sound like adventure. Understanding this doesn't diminish the workers, it reveals the system. And revealing the system matters more than preserving mythology, even if the mythology is what tourists want and publishers buy, and most people prefer to the documented reality that Sarah spent 3 years uncovering in archives nobody visits and cemeteries nobody maintain. The question that started everything has an answer now. The Hashknife wasn't the birthplace of the cowboy legend, it was a crime scene where that story was invented to legitimize theft. Both things are true. And Sarah drives away knowing that documenting truth matters even when mythology sells better, because the numbers don't lie and the grass remembers, and somewhere in those unmarked graves in Holbrook are people who deserve better than being erased from the story of the empire their labor built and their wages couldn't sustain. Chapter 15. The Prairie Remembers. The barbed wire still stands. Sarah touches the fence post one last time, weathered wood marked with the Hashknife brand, iron burned into grain that's been splitting under Arizona sun for over a century. The wind moves through grass that's returned to land the Aztec Land and Cattle Company nearly destroyed, growth measured in decades rather than seasons because ecological damage compounds faster than recovery, and some wounds don't fully heal. She's finished her research. The book will be published next year by a university press that expects to sell maybe 3,000 copies to people who already know that frontier mythology obscures more than it reveals. It won't change anything. Tourism will continue celebrating cowboys without mentioning wages. Roadside attractions will present the Hashknife as heritage rather than extraction. And descendants of the men who built this empire with their labor will keep working for wages, while descendants of the merchants who profited from that labor will keep owning land. This is what history does when it becomes mythology. It selects heroes and erases systems, celebrates outcomes and ignores mechanisms, turns complex extraction into simple adventure. The Hashknife story is too complicated for markers. You can't explain wage exploitation, ecological collapse, and corporate bankruptcy in 3 paragraphs with a sunset photograph. You can't acknowledge that the cowboy era was economically catastrophic for almost everyone involved without undermining the narrative that America was built on opportunity rather than extraction. And you can't tell tourists driving Route 66 that the West they're romanticizing was a massive transfer of wealth from workers and investors to merchants and land speculators, mediated through cattle that died in arroyos and grass that took a century to regenerate. Sarah has proven what she set out to prove. The Hashknife wasn't the birthplace of the cowboy legend. It was evidence that the legend was necessary to obscure what actually happened. Eastern investors lost millions. Cowboys died broke. The land was destroyed. Merchants got rich. And the mythology that emerged from this disaster celebrated independence, adventure, and frontier spirit, while systematically erasing the wage system, the bankruptcy courts, and the ecological damage that revealed how frontier capitalism actually worked. Both things are true. The Hashknife was a symbol of American ambition, and it was a crime scene where that ambition destroyed everything it touches. History prefers the symbol. Sarah has documented the crime. The grass remembers. Not consciously, grass doesn't have memory or agency or historical awareness. But the land Sarah stands on carries evidence that contradicts every tourist brochure. Soil composition changed by overgrazing, water tables depleted by demands they couldn't sustain, erosion patterns that reveal how quickly stability disappears when protective vegetation is stripped away. The prairie remembers through arroyos that didn't exist before 1885, through invasive species that outcompete natives in degraded soil, through springs that flow only during wet years instead of year-round like they did before 60,000 cattle grazed the watershed beyond its capacity. This is memory as physical fact. The land itself is evidence. And the evidence contradicts the mythology every time someone looks past the romance and examines what actually remains. 3 years of research, thousands of documents. One question answered in ways that create more questions about how we tell history, who benefits from the stories we choose to preserve, and what we lose when mythology becomes more valuable than accuracy. Sarah will publish her book. Scholars will cite it, and tourists will keep taking photographs at restored line camps where mannequin cowboys represent adventure without acknowledging the wage ledgers that show those cowboys earned $35 per month and died without enough wealth to buy the land they worked. The tension between documentation and mythology isn't resolvable. Both serve purposes, both contain truth, and both exclude the perspectives that would most complicate their narratives. Sarah drives away. The barbed wire stays. And somewhere in unmarked graves, scattered across North Arizona, are people who built the cowboy legend through labor that earned them nothing except mythology that erased their names. The Hashknife was the birthplace of that legend and the crime scene where it was invented. Both. Always both. And the grass keeps growing back, slowly, incompletely, carrying evidence that won't fit in stories we prefer to tell about who we are and how we got here. Chapter 16. What Remains. The fence post stands where Sarah first found it, Hashknife brand burned into wood that's weathered more than a century of Arizona sun. Barbed wire, singing the same note it sang when this investigation started 3 years ago. She's published the book. University presses don't do publicity tours, so there were no readings, no interviews, just a print run of 3,000 copies that sold mostly to libraries and scholars who already understood that frontier mythology obscures extraction. Some descendants of Hashknife cowboys bought copies, people searching for ancestors who appear in wage ledgers but nowhere else, looking for connection to heritage that offers identity without wealth or property or anything except stories about men who worked for $35 per month and died without leaving names. The reviews were positive in academic journals nobody reads. Tourism operators ignored it. And Route 66 attractions continue presenting the Hashknife as adventure rather than crime scene. Sarah has moved on to other research. There are dozens of failed cattle operations across the West, each with similar patterns, each producing mythology that celebrates what failed and erases why it failed. The King Ranch in Texas, the XIT in the Panhandle, the Swan Land and Cattle Company in Wyoming, all followed the Hashknife blueprint. Overgraze the range, underpay the workers, issue optimistic reports to distant investors, and collapse when ecology or markets or simple mathematics revealed that the business model required infinite grass and cooperative climate that never materialized. Some lasted longer than others. None made sustainable profits for investors. Almost none generated wealth for workers. And all created mythology that celebrates ranchers and cowboys while systematically erasing the wage systems, bankruptcy courts, and ecological damage that reveal how frontier capitalism actually functioned. The barbed wire keeps singing. Sarah has her answer. The Hashknife was both birthplace of the cowboy legend and crime scene where that legend was invented to obscure theft. The question forced a binary interpretation, but the answer is dual. Both things are true simultaneously, and understanding requires holding both truths without reducing complexity to choose sides. Eastern investors genuinely believed they were building something permanent. They also genuinely destroyed everything they touched through ignorance and greed, operating in systems designed to extract maximum value, regardless of sustainability. The cowboys genuinely worked hard. They also genuinely stayed poor, because hard work doesn't create wealth in systems where wages are fixed and ownership is concentrated elsewhere. The land genuinely fed people. It also genuinely suffered damage that required a century of recovery and still isn't finished. History preserves what serves present purposes. The Hashknife serves tourism, provides identity for communities wanting frontier heritage, and offers moral lessons about perseverance that ignore the structural forces determining success and failure. Sarah's book serves a smaller audience, people willing to examine how systems work, rather than celebrating outcomes those systems produced. Both versions matter. Both contain truth, and both exclude perspectives that would most complicate their narratives. The Mexican vaqueros, who invented cowboy techniques and appear in records as 6 Mexicans without names, the native peoples whose land became railroad grants, became speculation, became bankruptcy, the women who cooked and cleaned in line camps for wages even lower than cowboys earned, if they earned wages at all. The grass has returned to land the Hashknife nearly destroyed, slowly, incompletely, with scars that mark what happened here, arroyos cutting through meadows, invasive species outcompeting natives, water sources that flow intermittently instead of year-round. This is memory as evidence, the land itself contradicting mythology every time someone looks past romance and examines what actually remains. Sarah stands at the fence post where this started. The barbed wire sings. The brand marks wood that will stand another century if weather allows. And somewhere in archives and cemeteries across northern Arizona is evidence that will never fit into stories tourists want or publishers sell, or most people prefer to the documented reality that frontier capitalism worked exactly like modern capitalism, extracting value from workers and nature, concentrating wealth among intermediaries, and producing mythology that celebrates everything except the mechanisms determining who won and who lost. This is what remains: barbed wire, brand marks, wage ledgers, bankruptcy filings, cemetery records, and one historian's book documenting what the mythology erases. The Hashknife was the birthplace of the cowboy legend. The Hashknife was a crime scene, Both. Always both. And the wind keeps singing through wire stretched across land that belonged to no one and everyone, and ultimately to whoever had capital or patience to claim it after the speculators went bankrupt and the cowboys died without leaving names worth recording.